Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with David Schoen, a noted civil rights and criminal defense lawyer who represented President Trump during the Senate impeachment hearings over his actions on January 6th. David, good to see you. What do you make of the latest charges against Donald Trump?
Well, there's a lot to make of it, I suppose. It's the third of what I believe will be 4 indictments against former President Trump. And this one, many people would suggest is the most momentous in terms of its sort of national importance. I think it's certainly written that way. From my perspective, I think it's a very unfortunate event. I don't think it should have been brought. I don't think that the events of that day should be criminalized as to Donald Trump's actions, thoughts, etc. I think it sets a very dangerous precedent. Interestingly, the reaction to it that I've seen, at least, has been as polarized as everything else in the country these days, with some suggesting that it's a slam dunk, that because it's so detailed, there's no way to wriggle out, with others suggesting it's nothing but a broad political screed that tries to criminalize a legitimate, whether right or wrong, but a legitimate exercise of First Amendment rights to challenge the results of an election in specific ways. I do think that one thing that's particularly unfair with these long speaking indictments is, it lays out all of these specific allegations as if fact, when they may just be, the testimony of one witness or another with certain motivations that aren't tested in the document itself. And then the government moves for a protective order in these cases so the defendant can't comment publicly on it. I think that's problematic. But just to get, last thing I want to say on this is to give you an example of, how broad the spectrum is. While I say on the one hand, many people say, this is a slam dunk and so serious. Even the New York Times today, Dave Leonard's column says, listen, it's not so clear, and it's not clear that this is a crime. This is a novel theory. And the Wall Street Journal has a column saying it's another troubling Trump indictment. Has dangerous implications for the institution of the presidency.
Well,
so it's a serious matter.
Let me go back. I want to unpack this a little bit, and I should point out the fact that you've represented Democrats, socialists. So, you often get painted with the same stripe as the client that we're talking about at that moment. But you've represented many people in cases that are similar to this, I'm sure. Actually, you have. I'm sure you haven't. So I'm going to strike that. Let me ask the question differently. Let me unpack this a bit, David, in terms of, is this, you said, I believe the term you used was it long? What did you say about the indictment that's unusual? So,
indictment. It's a long speaking indictment.
Okay, so sorry, thank you. So, David, let's unpack this a little bit. You mentioned the term long speaking indictment. What do you mean by that?
Well, often, indictment really just has to charge the statutory section and lay out sufficient facts to give the defendant notice of what he or she is being charged with so that person can defend against it and to protect against double jeopardy. Let's say the person gets acquitted and the government comes back and says, well, that's not really what we meant the first time around. So there should be enough specificity for that. Sometimes that's fleshed out in a bill of particulars. In any event, this is written more as a political document. I think the justification the Smith team would use would be to say, listen, it's a matter of great importance to the American people, and so we're going to lay out the evidence that we have in detail. I think the other side of it would be it's very unfair because you're just taking someone's word for it who, without being able to cross-examine that person. And secondly, you've omitted a number of relevant things. So, for example, Mr. Smith in the indictment.
This is the special counsel we're talking about here?
Yes, I'm sorry, Jack Smith, special counsel. In the indictment, takes an excerpt from one of President Trump's speech on January 6th. But he omits the part that the defenders of President Trump highlight, and that is to demonstrate peacefully and patriotically. That's certainly relevant to the idea if the suggestion in or the assertion in the indictment is that President Trump encouraged or intended to encourage violence. Certainly relevant that he said peaceful and patriotic.
You've defended him, during the Senate impeachment trial, as I mentioned. What is the best recourse for President Trump? What advice would you give him in this situation?
A very specific factor to this case is that in terms of the conspiracy charges, conspiracy is what's called a specific intent crime. So they have to show that 2 or more people agreed to commit the goal of the conspiracy, knowing that it was forbidden by the law. They intended to do something the law prohibits or forbids. In this case, if President Trump genuinely believed that the election was stolen from him, or that his 75 million plus voters were cheated, and that he had to take steps his advisors told him to take, then really all of the charges are negated because they all require that frame of mind. Now, you might say, well, one of them, the charge under 18 USC 1512 C2, that's one of the obstruction charges, uses the word corruptly for the state of mind. That's problematic because it's a bit vague. But anyway, the point is here, one of the primary defenses will have to be his state of mind. I can tell you this, without any hesitation, President Trump believed then, believes today, with his heart and soul, that he was cheated, that the election was stolen, that improprieties occurred, that stopped his win, that he actually won the election, and so on. And he acted out of that frame of mind. And I can also tell you that at all times he was advised by these lawyers around him. You can be sure that President Trump didn't come up with the idea of alternative electors. You wouldn't expect a businessman to necessarily even understand the system of electors, which, by the way, isn't so clear anyway. It varies among the states, whether electors are bound to vote for the popular vote and so on. Anyway, there's a lot here. It's a fascinating case.
So I want to clarify, you are not currently working with President Trump on this case, correct?
Correct. I am not.
But you have worked with him in the past. I'm curious, what was that like, especially during that very heated period?
Yeah. It's funny. I think most people, I would have to say, are surprised by my answer to this because of the public persona we see. I'm not at all involved with politics. I don't know anybody who knew President Trump. I got a call out of the blue to represent him. Literally, I'm a solo practitioner in Montgomery, Alabama. Every single dealing that I have had with President Trump, in every conversation, he's been as gracious as any client I think I've ever had. It's as if I'm doing him a huge favor in representing him. He's been tremendously complimentary. I really appreciate that very much. And I've never seen any other side of him, and I've talked to him many, many times. So the experience for me was a fascinating one. I wouldn't have passed it up, even though, I've been a civil rights lawyer for 38 years. I represent the ACLU and all of the litigation in Alabama for 20, 30 years. That's not typically associated with President Trump. And as you mentioned, I represented a socialist candidate for president 2020. She didn't win. Had she won, I don't think we would be here today.
Well, let's get to the civil rights part of this. Do you feel that his civil rights are being impinged? It's an unusual case. He was president. He's now a presidential candidate. What do you make of that?
I'll tell you why I think the civil rights angle is particularly relevant. One of the counts in this case charges him with conspiracy to violate, in the sense, the civil rights of Americans. That's section 18 USC 241. That, I think, is sort of the ultimate irony, certainly from his perspective, but also maybe the most polarizing of all of the claims, because he acted, I'm sure his side would say, in support of the civil rights of the 75 plus million voters that he had. He didn't intend to violate anyone else's rights because he thought he won the election. And he acted out of that motivation at all times. And of course, the main civil rights sort of issue people mention is the First Amendment aspect of this case. How far did that go? How far does political speech go? At what point is the political speech criminalized versus, Smith's team would say, no, it wasn't. We're not penalizing speech. In fact, in the indictment, he purports to say that, we understand Americans are free to say what they want to say, but that in this case, it crossed the line sort of thing. That's going to be a matter of heated litigation, I'm sure.
Well, it's interesting. You talked about mens rea earlier, and, the legal structure we have, just because you wish something was true or you want something to be true. Part of the subtext of this case is about the peaceful transition of power and a respect for the institutions, especially, the voting rights of all Americans. I mean, I'm curious, again, as a civil rights attorney, as somebody who's worked with Donald Trump, is it sufficient to simply believe you've won when evidence is to the contrary?
That's a great question. Here's what I think the answer is to that in this specific context. Many people, reasonable people, maybe most people, can believe that the response to a belief that the election was stolen or whatever that, however you want to phrase it, was wrong. This shouldn't have been the response, either as a matter of law or as a matter of fact or as a matter of prudential factors for the country. But what we've done here with this indictment is to criminalize it. And so one's belief and intent is directly relevant to an element in the criminal law. And that's where I think we've gone wrong here. I don't think this should have been criminalized, however much anyone believes it was wrongheaded. That's why we have the ballot box. Cast your vote accordingly.
What about allegedly fomenting and encouraging essentially an attack on the Capitol? Is that captured in this indictment, do you think, or do you feel like they sidestepped that?
Another great question. I do think it's captured in the indictment, and I think they sidestepped it. I think that, there's this whole squad of cheerleaders behind the scenes that writes these model prosecution memos for Lisa Monaco or Jack Smith, Lisa Monaco in the Justice Department also.
Right.
Jack Smith and so on. And they predicted that there would be a charge of insurrection in this case. I think many people thought you might see criminal insurrection or sedition or seditious conspiracy. That's absent from this indictment. I think, frankly, it was smart for Mr. Smith to leave it out of the indictment. I think it would have complicated the matter. I think it would have raised additional constitutional parameters. I think there would have been a claim, what's the status of his acquittal from the impeachment trial and so on, which may still be relevant in this case. But I said publicly on a show that I think he would rue the day if he charged insurrection in the case.
Yeah. Well, let me pivot over quickly, if you don't mind, to the other side of the aisle. We've had a lot of news around Hunter Biden, the son of the current president. Very similar rhetoric, very different situation. Curious to know what you make of that as somebody who's watching Washington.
Right. There's a tie-in, some would suggest, with this also. Some supporters of President Trump have said that each of these announced indictments or a superseding indictment has coincided with very damning evidence with the Hunter Biden or Hunter Biden, President Biden connection and so on. There is a question why they waited until now, why we're in the middle of the election season, and why this timing seems to be as it is. I can't answer that. But you've asked me a different question a bit. I just suggest there's a tie-in. I don't know what to make of it. I think Hunter Biden seems like a pitiful character. I happen to be friends with one of his primary lawyers, a man I respect greatly, Abby Lowell, and I think that Hunter Biden, as I say, it's a pitiful situation, what's happened in his life and so on. However, I think that when President Biden sort of raised the stakes during the debates during the election and since then, with blanket statements about either Hunter Biden not making any money from China or that he, President Biden, as vice president or as father, never spoke to Hunter Biden about his business dealings, then I think he raised the specter of something suspicious, at least, or questionable, that he has to answer to the American people for. There's all of this talk about impeachment, and some suggestion they'll convene an impeachment inquiry to have more resources to investigate and all of that. I have to say, I'm not a fan of routine use of impeachment. I didn't think.
But are there grounds here? Would there be grounds for impeachment?
There's grounds so far, I think, from what we know, for an impeachment inquiry. I don't know about articles of impeachment, quite frankly, and I'm afraid it would look like a political maneuver, which it might be. I think we have to see how it plays out. The transcript from Devin Archer might offer some additional information. There's also the question about actions that preceded the presidency, whether those are appropriately part of it. I think the House theory, by the way, in the Trump second impeachment would have to hold that President Biden could be subject to impeachment for actions before or after his time in the presidency. That's why I thought it was a very mistaken jurisdictional argument.
Well, I'm not going to ask you how you'll vote in 2024 because that is a personal decision. But what's on your radar that you would put on ours, David, in terms of what you're watching at this point with, very complicated cases?
I think the question is, the interesting factor is President Trump is soaring in the polls, at least among Republican voters. And, he seems to be at least even with President Biden in a head-to-head. Some would suggest that's a sad commentary, but I don't know what to make of it exactly, except I do think, at least where I live in the South, there is a significant contingent that feels these indictments are political weaponization of the Justice Department, honestly, and that it's just piling on. I think they run that risk. When the fourth indictment comes out, I think they're going to run the risk. How many people does anyone know, including Jack the Ripper, who faced, 4
never caught, by the way? So I digress.
I don't know. I don't know how it's going to play out. I mean, either it's going to be overwhelming, and it will, the other Republican candidates are going to speak out more forcefully that this being a distraction. That doesn't seem to hit any of the base as persuasive. Or it's going to, President Trump's going to continue to soar in the polls, and he will be the candidate.
Great. Well, I definitely look forward to continuing the conversation with you, and thank you for joining us, David.
Thank you so much.